Hey everyone, this is our third week through the series through the month of August. We've been spending some time in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 17, and we're going to pick up in verse 14 here. And I just want to recap real quick the last 2 weeks. Paul is encouraging us to set our minds on the things above. He says this in chapter 3, verse 1. He says, if you've been raised with Christ, so if we're Christians and we believe that Jesus has died and rose again, and that we get to have a living relationship with him, he says, seek the things that are above. And so as he goes on, he first talks about the things that we need to get rid of, right? This anger that he talks about. And then he actually lists some sexual sins, and then he lists some social sins as well. After he goes through this list of things that we need to address in our lives, that was the first week that we addressed the first 11 verses here in this chapter. Last week, we just focused on a couple of verses. This is what he says in chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. These verses hopefully should sound familiar. He says, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And that's where we left off, this challenge then to think about the things that we can start doing in our lives as we seek to understand who Jesus was and who Jesus is, but also who Jesus calls us to be. And so we've been talking about these characteristics, or these things that make up our character as Christians. And we're just going to spend today with just a couple more verses as he expands on this. He lists these things, these 5 things, and then he talks about bearing with one another and forgiving with one another. And then in verse 14, he says this. It says, and above all these things, put on love. Put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. That's what he says in verses 14 and 15, Colossians chapter 3. It says, above all these things, above showing compassion, above showing kindness, above showing humility, above showing gentleness, above showing patience, to put on love. Because love binds these things together. I want you to think about that for a second, because it could seem a little weird to say last week, hey, we need to focus on these individual things. And now it's like, okay, well, we're supposed to put on love, which is above all these things. So why am I focusing on these things? I want you to think about it this way. As you have a relationship with somebody, let's say your parents, I could say, love your parents, right? And you can think of that. But throughout the day, throughout the weeks, throughout the months, throughout the years, you can think of all sorts of different scenarios, all sorts of different conflicts that have come up, all sorts of different conversations, right? Or situations that have come up where it's required different things. Maybe it's required patience in some situations, and maybe forgiveness in others, where you responded with anger or maybe in an inappropriate way, right? Or the kindness or compassion, right? All these different things call for different ways for us to react in different situations. And as we think about what loving somebody looks like, in my opinion, it's looking at all these situations and be able to provide the necessary reactions and emotions and things in those situations, which binds all those together. So when we say, I love you, and I'm going to love you, and I'm going to show my love to you, that those things are incorporated into that. Paul actually describes what love is in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. And this passage is usually used in weddings, right? But this is a good description of just what love is in general. This is what he says. He says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. When we love somebody, they get to experience kindness. They get to experience patience. They get to experience compassion. And so while we might say, hey, love somebody or love this person, right? Or be loving in your relationships. The greatest commandment, right? Love God. And Jesus says the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so that word gets thrown around a lot. But I want us to make sure we understand that it incorporates lots of different things. And so as we read this passage, right, especially going into last week, this compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, if you have a complaint, forgiving one another, that is love, binding all those things together in perfect harmony. And then he says this in verse 15, he says, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Question for you. What is ruling in your heart today? I want you to think about that. What is taking over your heart? Is it anger about something? Is it sadness? Is it anxiety about something? Maybe it's the upcoming school schedule. Or maybe it's anxiety about a conflict that you had, right? And figuring out how to deal with that, right? We allow our hearts to feel different things, and our heart kind of controls our emotions at times, and we need to be aware of what is ruling our hearts. What Paul wants us to do is to let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts. And so what I want you to do as a result after this message, after you get done playing this video, is to have a conversation with Jesus. To spend some time in prayer. Maybe it's just 2 or 3 minutes. Find somewhere quiet where no one else is around, and ask him to reveal to you what is in your heart. Maybe even ask him, hey, show me what is ruling my heart today. And then ask him to show you peace. Ask him to fill your heart with peace, to let your heart be ruled by peace. And if we get in the habit of doing that on a daily basis, it's not like we're making a wish, right? But we're talking to Jesus. We're having a conversation because we have a living relationship with him, right? And so we need to express how we're feeling and what's going on. And at the end of the day, I think we would all agree that we want peace to be ruling in our hearts. But a lot of times we let things happen in our hearts, but we don't address it. And we aren't even aware because we're moving too fast. Before the school year starts, and maybe for some of you the school year already has started, right? Spend some time with Jesus and let peace rule in your heart. He says after that, says, to which indeed you were called in one body. Again, this sense of unity, this sense of harmony, right? And he ends it with this verse. He says, and be thankful. He'll expand a little bit on that in these last couple verses in chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, which we'll cover next week. But I want to stop here, and I want you to apply this somehow. How is God speaking to you today? Maybe it's about a certain situation, and maybe it's going back to last week, and it's the patience, right? Or the forgiveness that you need to offer somebody. Or maybe it's just love in general, and maybe it's doing a Bible word study, right? On what love is, doing some sort of study online. There's several tools and resources that you can use. Blue Letter Bible, I believe it's .org. BlueLetterBible.org is a tool where you can do a word study, and so maybe it's not necessarily emotional, but maybe it's for you to have a better understanding of what love is in Scripture and understanding the different ways love is being described. There's 3 different words throughout the New Testament that is used for love. So maybe it's doing a word study and understanding just this grasp of what love is in the New Testament. I don't know how God is encouraging you to respond, but I do want you to respond. I at the very least want you to have a conversation with Jesus and to just be real with him and just to express your emotions, whatever you're feeling. Ask him for certain things. If you're lacking some of these things, ask him to speak to you and to fill your heart with some of these things. And then be intentional as you go throughout your day, as you spend time in your relationships, as you're sitting around the dinner table. Be aware of how you can be working on these things, how you can build up the character in yourself and be loving. Jesus says in John 13:35 that we're known as his disciples by the love that we have for one another. And so I hope that you choose to do that today and for the rest of this week. We'll see you soon.